Hello and welcome to Deep Dive Perspective, a show which is really focused on presenting counter-cultural narratives, counter-political narratives, really a space for those voices which often get drowned out in the mainstream media. Increasingly, we find cancel culture, censorship becoming more and more fashionable to the detriment of freedom of speech. No such thing here on our podcast. Here, we would love to open up those issues which really affect people and try to get to the bottom of them. It's all very well trying to deal with the symptoms of a problem, but what about the context and the root causes of these problems? And for that matter, what about the solutions? Too little time is spent on these. Do like, share and subscribe the channel and let others know that this is a space for you to hopefully get a fair discussion and a deep discussion. And with me today in the show, we have Stephen Bell, who's currently treasurer of Stop the War Coalition. Has also had a very colourful career in the workers' rights movements, and also I believe you've done many other work for the British society. But your subject today that I've asked you to come in for, Stephen, is going to be war, Yemen, the Syrian situation in West Asia, and just generally the rise of the global South in relation to the global North, which has enjoyed dominance arguably for centuries now. So we're going to try to unpack what's going on and what's happening in a world which is clearly in flux. And I'll let you really set the scene first for your kind of overarching perspective on this, and then perhaps go into more depth.
Well, I think that the key is the actual economic rise of the global South. If we go back to 1993, 57% of the global GDP was produced by the global North. Today, that figure is 41%. Consequently, the global South is now producing 59% of total global GDP. Within that, you've had primarily the rise of China and to a lesser extent the rise of India. But what has happened is that you've had a dramatic decline of the influence and weight of the G7 countries and essentially the United States, which holds the G7 together. If we go back to 1993, our starting point, the United States represented 20% of the global GDP. China represented 5%. So 4 times as large as China. That's as recently as 1993. Today, those figures are 19% for China and 16% for the United States. That is why we have this enormous international tension led by the activities of the US government. No longer can they simply outcompete their rivals. They are now facing the fact that government after government in the United States has been unable to stem their decline, and hence we see the consistent resort to military force, where the United States remains absolutely dominant on a world scale. It is responsible, its military spending represents 53% of world spending on armaments and so on. So that it's using its military power to try and reverse what it could no longer achieve through purely economic means. And that's the source of the huge international tension we're dealing with.
And the bulk of that tension seems to be focused around West Asia, it seems, though Ukraine, of course, can be brought into the equation clearly, as well as the maritime power zones, that route for trade, which China is increasingly also beginning to compete with the Americans, what with Gwadar in Pakistan and other ports that they're increasingly paying attention to. Sri Lanka was a very famous case. But this competition is clearly there, and there's clearly a threat which is acknowledged by the Americans, Trump more so than anybody, because he seems to, as part of his election, if you like, campaign, was very, very strong on this idea of slapping tariffs and punishing and economically, basically sanctioning other nations. The Russians are already massive victims of it. The Iranians are also massive victims. The Syrians were too. It seems as though that plan that we heard about many moons ago, just at the turn of the century, I think it was retired General McGregor at that time who talked about how 7 nations were scheduled to be invaded by the Americans, and he didn't. He said, well, what for? And they said, well, I don't know. I guess they've got nothing better to do. Well, it wasn't just they had nothing better to do. They clearly targeted, as far as I can see, Stephen, those nations which weren't linked to the World Bank, number one. That was Syria, Libya, Somalia was on the list. I believe Iran clearly was. Iraq was on that list, and Afghanistan. None of them were connected to the Bank of International Settlements in a formal way, as many other nations. So I'm trying to connect this also to the economics on a bigger scale. But for America, I mean, if we begin with America and its kind of dominance of the West Asian region, isn't it natural that an imperialist power, one which relies on the resources of these nations in order to accumulate wealth, will naturally kick back? Is that not what empires do by nature?
Well, I mean, certainly it is what we have come to expect from the imperialist powers. I mean, we've been witnessing that for hundreds of years now. However, what's important to register is that what China has done has been entirely peaceful, and that it hasn't conquered anybody in its economic rise, and that's what makes it so extraordinary in world historic terms. The fact that, according to the World Bank, it's lifted 860 million Chinese out of poverty without conquering any country, without plundering any country. This is the future of humanity, is through cooperation with China. However, a declining power like the United States sees that as a threat. Rather than engage in win-win economics, it believes it has to violently uproot the conflict, the competition, and instead impose its will. Trump's view of the significance of tariffs is merely an extension of a policy which has also been sustained by the Democratic presidents. If you recall, it was actually Obama who began the pivot to Asia, which was a pivot to confront China. That was the idea, and it was accelerated in Trump's first presidency, and further consolidated and accelerated by Biden. So this is a policy which is bipartisan in one sense, and an expression of the diplomatic and political decline of US power. They think they can't reorganize the world through diplomacy, through engagement. Instead, it has to be violent shocks. And when they see the initiatives of China, say it's One Belt, One Road initiatives, its engagement with many nations in West Asia, they think this is a threat. Rather than this is something which is lifting the peoples of the region, lifting their living standards, instead this is posed as a threat. And of course, in reality, if you're a declining power, you don't have the same resources. And so the US can't offer, as it did say during the 50s and 60s, to many developing countries. There was no lacking of coercion, but there was financial resources, there was engagement, which did impact. Famously, you had, for example, President Kennedy's Alliance for Progress. And there's no sense of that now from the United States. Instead, it's direct confrontation. Everybody's an enemy. And everybody has to either agree and be subordinated, or they will be confronted.
Well, going back maybe a decade or more, ago, maybe even slightly longer than that, a couple of decades, Taiwan came on the agenda, and of course Hong Kong as well. These two were the preliminary signs of America rattling its sabers and going into China's backyard. And actually, even now, we see Taiwan still very much at the center of any potential flare-up between China and America. And the Americans are clearly backing the Taiwanese to stay out of China's orbit. Do you see that as a flashpoint which could genuinely create military confrontation between China and America eventually?
Well, certainly it could. And indeed, the rhetoric is there, has been in there in US foreign policy establishment for a long time, and various the idea of promoting China as a systemic threat. This is, it is discussed within NATO as if it is an absolute certainty. And in Britain, for example, if you look at British foreign policy documents, Russia, China and Iran are a threat. I mean, what unites those countries is that Britain has invaded them all, and none of those countries have invaded Britain. But they're the threat. And this hysterical dialogue which exists inside NATO is exactly an expression of decline. So instead of engaging with these rising powers and working economic and diplomatic cooperation, it's confrontation. It will not be successful, however. What's clear is that the US is losing the economic battle, and tariffs will not assist. On the contrary, our whole experience of the 1920s and the 1930s was that tariffs accelerated the crisis. They didn't solve the economic problems that the US or other European nations were facing. On the contrary, they brought them into conflict.
I know that China's economic relationship with America is a huge one. I mean, many say that the Chinese economy underwrites American economy. American economy is 30 trillion plus in debt at the moment to the money lending fraternity or whoever it is out there who has this debt on their heads. The Chinese aren't in debt. It seems they seem to be, of course, making progress, still growing, although slowed down. But I'm trying to work out American confrontation with China, given that there is a trade and economic necessity between the two, seems to make it even more nonsensical that they have an economic battle or a military struggle.
Well, I mean, the formal position for a start-off is that the United States formally recognised the one China policy. They recognise that Taiwan is part of China. So this is a breach developing within sort of the US, the coherence of its policy. But then that's the sign of a crisis when you're exactly. If you want to outcompete China, you have to develop your economy. You can't simply do it unless you can basically set their economy back, and that is clearly what Trump and his allies believe is possible and necessary. The tariffs are part and parcel of that attempt to disengage and prevent China's further economic development. The facts of the matter are that immediately the Chinese economy is continuing to grow much faster than the United States. The likelihood is that China's economy for 2024 will register between 4.8 and 5% annual growth. The IMF estimates that the United States will be between 2.6 and 2.8%. So this is sustained growth by the China, and it cannot be simply reversed. And of course, it's one thing for the United States to finance a genocide in Palestine against an already impoverished, dispersed, and largely defenseless people, right? But to confront a nuclear armed power as China has the largest army in the world, this is a different order of conflict altogether. And whatever the rhetoric, the facts are it would be catastrophic for the world if the United States does move towards military confrontation with China.
I was reading just yesterday that China has unveiled the first seventh generation military aircrafts, state of the art, advanced more than the F-35s, which are sixth generation. Bullet trains that can go 320 miles an hour or ridiculous speeds. Expansion of their own infrastructure internally. Deals with Iraq, with Iran, with Afghanistan, all to do with developing this Belt Road Initiative. All of this, and fraternal relationships, literally with every country in the world. I don't think they have any problems with virtually any nation. Maybe Japan and the Western aligned nations, but they're not putting themselves in a confrontational situation, certainly in terms of their foreign policy. They seem to constantly want peace. They want to have diplomatic relations which are secure, and they want to focus on this economy. Given that that's where China is there a point where these areas where naturally competition is going to increase, so I'm talking about Central Asia and West Asia in particular, which is where America is concentrating much of its military muscle, showing its power. And that's exactly one of the key areas for the Chinese Belt Road. The old Silk Road runs through there. You can't get a road system that will connect the world without having a stable central part of the world, i.e. West Asia primarily, and Central Asia, I guess. So is part of their plan to destabilize West Asia, you think, also to destabilize this Belt Road Initiative?
I think absolutely that's the case. The United States is no longer, say, dependent upon West Asia for oil. Essentially, it produces its own oil. It doesn't want these resources to fall into other hands, and therefore it has got a military interest. However, it's not dependent for them directly for oil. What it does want to do is to prevent them from becoming part of a developed economy which is not dominating. And consequently, if you look, say, at the intervention that it's made since 2011 especially, consistently it has tackled those states which have a degree of independence, genuine independence from it, so that whether it is Libya, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, all of these are seen as republics which have a dangerous degree of independence in their foreign policy, and therefore have been confronted. They do not wish to simply surrender their resources to Western control. Therefore, they can be confronted and overturned. Because if you look, who hasn't been attacked since 2011? Well, it's all the monarchies, right?
All the despotic dictatorships.
You make a deal with the families and it lasts a couple of 100 years. And you know that they aren't about to make any fundamental shift away from you. Even when you have, say, in the case of Saudi Arabia or the UAE, quite developed relations now with China and with Iran. Nevertheless, as far as the United States is concerned, there is a degree of political reliability in those states, which means that you can pull them in if they go, if you see them going too far. And anyway, it's better the devil you know than one that you don't know. And what happens is that republics tend to produce a very independent-minded population, whereas these monarchies, they know how to keep the population down. So I think that it's not coincidence that you've got the republics that have been confronted by the United States from 2001, 2003 onwards, really, and that this is at the same time that China is developing its whole westward pathways. And I think similarly, you see a similar process developing in Latin America, where exactly China is developing very strong relations with a number of Latin American governments, which are purely peaceful, which are developing the economy, but this is the US's traditional backyard, so that we see continued attempts to destabilize states in Latin America which have an independent attitude about their own resources. So I think it is not a coincidence. This is the nature of US foreign policy today.
Well, one aspect of US foreign policy which still isn't clear to a lot of people is that apart from the toolkit that they've got, the toolbox of dictators and monarchists and neoliberal puppets regimes around the world, they've got another very nasty toolkit which they keep very much in wraps, and that's terrorism. Terror cells, terror units. Time and time again, it's been revealed, even by the politicians themselves. Trump said it, Hillary Clinton said it. They said, we were behind Al-Qaeda. We were behind ISIS. It's not me saying it. It's not the opposition. It's not their enemies in West Asia. They're saying it themselves. And the facts and the evidence seems to increasingly point to the fact that America is the number one financier and purveyor of terrorist organizations around the world. And yet they are the ones also with all of the rhetoric which says we are fighting terrorism all over the world. They've also adopted it. It's quite a bizarre and quite a psychopathic kind of political scenario to be in, where you're saying you're going to tackle terrorism, but you're actually the main projector of that very thing. An example for you. In China, as we're still talking very much about the Chinese-American tussle, I can think of Muslim terrorist Salafist Takfiri groups, Uyghurs, they in Western China have been very much operating. In Burma, there are indications that there are such groups. Of course, in West Asia, it's a wash. You know, everybody from Al-Jundullah and ISIS Khorasan to the east side of West Asia, operating in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran against those countries and the incumbent governments of those countries. But also, of course, in the new arena, which is now making things much more public, is HTS. And Mr. Giuliani, who was essentially one of the number ones and twos and threes of Al-Qaeda and then ISIS too. And yet we have a scenario where it's increasingly clear that the Anglosphere, the American-led axis, if you like, is very comfortable with Mr. Giuliani. In fact, he's had a huge makeover. He wears suits and he looks slick. He has a trendy beard compared to what his previous guise was. Let's talk about America and terrorism and its kind of obsession with using that as a way of getting its way as well.
Well, I think that the relative decline of the United States means that this is more likely to be resorted to, because the CIA, since its foundation, has never pulled away from either directly initiating or using assets to engage in terrorism. But it's a very unreliable weapon. It can turn against you, as the United States has experienced on a number of occasions. People that you trained up and that you finance suddenly decide to go rogue against you. And obviously 9/11 was a clear evidence of that. Those people had been trained in Afghanistan by the CIA and so on. And equally al-Baghdadi, he made his first connections with al-Qaeda cadres while he was under US imprisonment in Iraq. And so, it wasn't that this guy came from nowhere.
Abu Ghraib and all these prisons that they had is where they seem to have nurtured them.
Most exactly, yes. And but I think what's different now, as I say, is that they're more liable to rely upon them because there's so little effective diplomacy from the United States. It doesn't have large sympathetic parties which it can work with. These days, it is forced to reach for the missile, the gun, the terrorist, in order to assert itself. Exactly in Syria, the United States and its allies since 2011 have sustained Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Al-Nusra, HTS, however you define it. They defined it as a terrorist organization, and they're now scrambling. I don't know if they've even caught up with their own law. Certainly, don't think they have in Britain yet. But this person that they're conveying had a bounty on his head until very recently. So I think it's part and parcel of that decline of influence, of diplomatic clout, of economic weight. And unfortunately, it's liable to continue. Surely you mentioned the Uyghurs, the East Turkestan independence movement will be doubtless utilised in coming years, as it has been in recent years against China, and to no great effect. I mean, you can't hold back a nation of 1.3 billion people on the basis of the activity of a handful of, extremely violent, fanatical nutcases. And, you have to do some... And the United States knows that. However, you can create chaos. And unfortunately, one of the things that we have to deduce from US policy since 2011, since the so-called Arab Spring, is that they prefer to leave a country in chaos than to have an independent republic facing them. And that, Libya was destroyed, has been destroyed as a country, as a state. You have 2 parliaments, 2 governments, 1,000-odd militias, open slave market, destruction of the infrastructure. Because why? Because that's better than Gaddafi. Because Gaddafi was independent. Because he raised the living standards of his people and still didn't agree to subordinate himself to the United States.
Both Gaddafi and Libya had something in common with Syria and Assad, for instance. Very stable nations, had a welfare state system. Everybody was given very healthy welfare funds and essentially affluent and comfortable nations. Both now lying in tatters, divided, very likely to be a source of problems for the world for some time to come. I mean, the Syrians are now beginning to feel the reality of the Al-Qaeda who are in power now, with more arrests, torture, killings, victimization of minorities, Christians, Alawites, all sorts. So that's the same playbook we had in Libya. Arguably, it would be the same one in Afghanistan, because for years that remained the situation. And even now, there's always the possibility that a new group could arise, and there's a very fragile state there. Pakistan and Afghanistan are having a ding-dong. But again, let's focus on that region, because we've gone through West Asia, but America hasn't finished there. They're still arguably, if they're in leagues with ISIS in Syria and they have a connection with this network, then the likes of ISIS Khorasan, the TTP, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, these forces which are causing chaos in Pakistan and even perhaps on the borders of Afghanistan, has now led to Afghanistan and Pakistan in a standoff, ready to go at each other. War of words and bullets are being fired. People are dying. But what I'm seeing is the Chinese, again, the Chinese CPEC. There was the Karakoram Road, which gave us a straight run from China right down to this new port of Gwadar in South Pakistan. Pakistan is a hugely important geopolitical place in any estimation, but it has Balochistan, which is what this road goes through. Balochistan has trillions of dollars of wealth. It's said that everything from copper mines through to oil to gas, and of course this port in the south. It seems that when America sees such a development, the Chinese want to develop this port into something which would potentially be very, very beneficial for Pakistan and perhaps the region. But they clearly made it their policy that Pakistan is not allowed to continue that in peace, because terrorist organizations are being unleashed to cause trouble. And the Chinese themselves, they have their own citizens who are working on these projects, being abducted, being shot, being killed. Balochistan is being kept in chaos. So there, I'm seeing the same playbook that you talk about there, almost as a way of threatening a sovereign nation to say, look, you behave yourself and do what we say, or else.
Yes, I agree. Although I think that although these forces that you refer to are exist, they're not sufficient at this point in time to overturn the existing governments. However, what the United States has played a role in is the coups that have taken place in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. Exactly because under Imran Khan and the leader of Bangladesh, a pro-Chinese orientation in the eyes of the United States was being carried out. Actually, what was being carried out was a more independent foreign policy. What was the most beneficial for Pakistan? What is the most beneficial for Bangladesh? And that was unforgivable. And so we've had two coups. And I think that's extremely disturbing, because it's part and parcel of the playbook, and in many ways it's more effective than terrorism. If you look at, for instance, the developments in Romania, you have a situation in Europe where no question about the election of an anti-war candidate to the presidency. No question about the legitimacy of the election, but still they've prevented that person from leading the country. Exactly because an independent foreign policy is the most dangerous thing in the eyes of the US and its allies in the EU. So I think that what you say is true, that along the road of the One Belt, One Road, the United States is attempting to uproot the social forces which sustain that initiative. And it's not because it's about Chinese control, it's because it's not American control. And the US wants to reassert its hegemony across the world.
So I could make Iraq an example. I probably won't focus because we've kind of covered West Asia in a way, but Iraq and Iran are a major source of potential war, impending war. America is saber rattling. Israel is exacerbating that kind of saber rattling of America versus Iran. And of course, that's a whole program in itself. One would have to do to unpack that. But clearly, that's a threat to the whole world. Very powerful ballistic missile equipped, possibly nuclear weapon equipped players within that game. And Trump is obviously unpredictable, to say the least. One doesn't know which way he would go. And the Zionist lobby that has a strong influence in America doesn't seem to be scared of breaking conventions and the conventions of war. And they seem to have no limit as to what's on the table. Now, after the genocide in Gaza, it seems as though new rule books have been established, if there is any rule at all, that they are willing to do anything in order to achieve whatever they want. And America seems to be willing to fund and support that as, again, a chaos creation, probably to make sure that that region stays embroiled in its own internal troubles, and they continue to dominate. As in Syria, the oil that gets siphoned off, Iraq's oil the money from the Iraq's oil cannot be spent without American say so. They control that. But let me turn to Europe, because you hinted at Europe, and it's important because people assume that Europe is benefiting from this American policy. But tell me about what benefit there is for Britain or for Europe, the EU, in having a confrontation with China or Russia, for that matter.
Well, there is precisely no benefit. And the alliances that the British government and the EU governments have and prioritise with the United States are coming home to roost. You have seen the destruction of the German economy, which is at a virtual standstill because of it's paying the price for US sanctions against Russia. Equally, most European economies have taken a very serious hit. I mean, they're paying phenomenal prices for liquid natural gas from the United States, which previously they were getting cheaply from Russia. Now, how is that in their interest? Meanwhile, the United States government is insisting, and will under Trump presumably make its formal policy, that its NATO allies in Europe devote 5% of their GDP to military expenditure. And in other words, the United States wants Europe to foot the bill for its foreign policy against Russia and its war against Russia, because the war in Ukraine is clearly has been promoted by NATO's eastward expansion and the United States' refusal to come to any security agreement with Russia, and vetoing attempts by the EU to come to a security agreement with Russia. So there is no benefit when in Britain and in France and Germany and elsewhere, the population are being faced with new rounds of austerity in order to fund huge payments towards their own military. And what's interesting is that the penny is beginning to drop. The most recent YouGov survey of European populations shows that the majority of the population in France, Germany and Italy all favour a negotiated settlement to the Ukrainian war over its continuation. In Britain, it's the narrow majority in favour of continuing the war, but it's a narrow majority, and that's obviously a shift. The situation is changing. And in November, in Ukraine itself, the Gallup poll showed that 52% of Ukrainians want a early and peaceful and negotiated end to the war, as compared to 38% of Ukrainians who want to continue the war. So exactly after 2 years of useless proxy initiatives against Russia, the majority of the population in Europe and in Ukraine is saying enough, we must have a new policy. Unfortunately, in Britain, we have a bipartisan parliament, just as we have a bipartisan Congress in the United States, still insisting at this point in time on continuing the war. Whether or not Trump will hold good to his pre-election promises to end the war, we shall see. I mean, certainly there will be considerable pressure upon him to continue. At least the argument will be, well, maybe we can negotiate a better deal if we continue the war. The difficulty is any politician in the United States has to face the fact they have taken a serious setback. And that's a difficult thing to convey to the electorate, that the victory that you promised is no longer on the table. But that's the reality of the matter, and it's the public is in advance of the politicians in that sense.
Well, a couple of things that came to mind about war and the consequence of war. We've talked about austerity and the economic hit that Europe is clearly feeling, and where we could park much of the blame on American foreign policy for this quite clearly. In Russia, Nord Stream being shut down, the pipeline being shut there, and the subsequent impact on the European economy, which is being covered up by most of the governments. But there is a strong element which is now beginning to raise it, as you say. I'd agree. But the other element which is really impacting European politics, and perhaps American politics to some extent, but in a different way, is the migrant issue. So Libya, when these wars were carried out by NATO in Libya, and it was destroyed essentially, there was a huge floodgate opened of migrants to Europe. Turkey, with Erdogan playing a very wily role, is very happy to use the migrants' transit zone from Turkey into Europe as a weapon to get what he wants from the EU as well, it seems. So those migrants are coming from where? Again, American-led forever wars in West Asia. So the migrant crisis, which is being presented to the people here, and it is a huge issue to the electorate in Europe, from what I can see, it's the main reason that right-wing organizations are getting most of the populist support now. But yet, actually, that migrant crisis could be largely resolved if they stopped these wars, presumably. Would you agree with that?
Well, most certainly. I mean, the majority of people attempting to cross the English Channel come from places like Afghanistan. And, you know, if you are holding the economy of Afghanistan after 20 years of war, you're holding the economy of Afghanistan in a vice. You've seized all the assets abroad of the Afghan people. You have sanctions against one of the poorest countries in the world, and you wonder why people are fleeing the country. Of course they will flee. I mean, it's the rational, sensible thing to do. And I agree with you. Politicians are manipulating the situation, pretending that they have had no role in creating this migration, in creating these refugees, let's call them what they are, right? And instead, they are saying this is somehow an economic phenomenon. It is not. It is a political phenomenon, a direct result of military action by the British government, by the US government, by the French government, and so on. When they cease their never-ending wars, as you put it, then there will be a change. People do not wish to cross continents in order simply to live. They do it out of desperation. And the situation in the countries where the intervention is continuing is desperate. So until there is an end to the belligerents, there will continue to be refugees.
Wars and economy are integrally linked. It seems out of those wars, America is very happy to pay Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or any of the other mega corporations, and that could bring in the BlackRocks of the world and all the investors that are sitting around in Wall Street and beyond. They make money whether America goes to war or not. When it doesn't go to war, I guess they can make money out of the trade and the rebuilding and the reconstruction. When America goes to war, well, there's money to be made out of missiles and the replenishment of more weapons and the killing. So it does strike me as though the relationship between big money power, we have to bring that into the conversation because Donald Trump has to play to the lobbies. The lobbies are not just Zionist in America, although that's where the focus is in what's been going on with Israel and the genocide of Gaza. But there are lots of very clear indications that Sheldon Addison's charitable fund, his wife Miriam, has openly declared she pumped in millions into Trump's election. Many others like that have done it. There is always a payback that politicians have to then do, one assumes, to all these lobby groups. And it calls into question the nature of democracy in America in particular, with such a reliance on these kinds of funds, less so perhaps in Europe, but still a huge influence of lobby groups here as well, it seems. So is that part of the effect that the more America continues, the more the West continues along these pathways, the less likely they are to be able to retain whatever little democracy, real democracy, we have left? Is that a threat to our freedoms and our liberties?
Well, it most certainly is. I mean, we've had experience of this, particularly in Europe during the 1920s and 1930s, when exactly the most belligerent forces attempting to resolve economic impasse, economic stagnation through not just foreign wars, but internal wars, civil, launching a war against the working people of their own country, essentially. And that is what Trump and friends have to do to some extent or another. there is limit to how much they can probably obtain from the rest of the world through military action. So they're going to have to, from their perspective, to maintain their vast wealth, because remember, Trump is of these people. He is no way an anti-establishment figure. He is the establishment, just as Farage is part of the establishment. These people aren't insurgents, friends of the common people. They are the establishment. They are the fabulously wealthy. And they believe to maintain their position, they are going to have to substantially reduce the living standards of their own people. And they do not balk at such an idea. And we have seen what such people did in Europe during the 1920s and 30s. And potentially, if they're allowed to get away with it, that's what they will do in the United States, Britain, Germany, France, and so on. So there is a threat. The forces of resistance obviously aren't just simply in West Asia and in the global south. There are also the trade unions, the labour organisations, the progressive movement and peoples in the north who now have to face up to the fact that to stand up against the racists and neo-colonists in their own society is a key duty and responsibility in the coming years. Otherwise, there is terrible suffering going to be visited upon people, because I agree, people like Trump will not balk. And we've seen it when he lost the election last time. He didn't balk at an attempted coup. That's what it was.
Yes.
He didn't succeed, but that's what it was. And certainly in the future, there's no reason to believe that if he thinks it's necessary, he would do it. And there are plenty of people like him in ruling circles in Europe as well.
Well, that does bring in this interesting question, which you probably a few decades ago wouldn't even have been in any conversation. But the internal self-destruct of a nation like America, or the Civil War signs or Civil War realities, could be the one thing that could actually also affect the decline and deliver the decline of an ascendant Anglosphere. It seems, because that Bible Belt, the most of what would be regarded as the MAGA movement, have got serious confrontations now. There are genuine political confrontations on the ground between these forces. One would, I don't know, on the other side, the neoliberal fraternity, and perhaps these chaps. Well, there are actually real differences in lifestyle questions, in perspective, socially and politically, which probably weren't that manifest previously. That difference, if the right kind of funding and support went into either party, could form a fragmentation, which could be very, very public. The haves and the have-nots, the people who want traditional families and those who want modern wokist style, societies. Do you think there's any chance of that level of fragmentation occurring? I mean, here as well, you get people making lots of noises over the migrant issue. Their passions are really raised, and there are elements that are going to two extremes. Do you think that still the centre is still very strong in these Western countries, in spite of these kinds of push-pull factors that are beginning to be thrown out?
Well, I think there's certainly, it's clear in Europe. If you look at the situation in Britain, Germany, and France and Italy, the biggest nations in the biggest economies in the EU. There is a great deal of fragmentation. I have to say, I don't think it's between the woke and the reactionaries. I think it's within reactionaries, and that the whole drive around migrants, and particularly the Islamophobic element, which is being systematically promoted, this is to whip up a social base which itself is disappointed, its living standards are not being raised, but it is being diverted into ignoring the austerity, ignoring the collapse of public services, and insist upon blaming the migrant, the Muslim, the newcomer, the person with black skin. All of these are the choice victims. I think that exists across Europe, in the United States, and it is the classics of bringing home the neo-colonial legacy. And we have a tremendous fight on our hands in the coming years to ensure that these new reactionary forces, I mean, they're old reactionary forces, we know this, but they have a confidence now born of the passiveness of the labour movement, the passiveness of the unions, the passiveness and disappearance of the socialist movement in many of these countries, right? That has given these people confidence, and they are now exerting it to the full. Plus, of course, you have the catastrophe of a failed war against Russia, is meaning that if I'm a reactionary in Germany and I'm saying we should end the war, then, and I think that we should launch a campaign against Muslims and that we should launch campaigns against Jews or people who are black, then you listen to me first when I say I'm against the war because it's costing us. And you maybe be more sympathetic to my racism once I've said that. This is the reality of the matter. The failures of the US foreign policy register very strongly in Europe, which has blindly followed that policy.
No, I think it's fascinating that we covered the global scenario and it comes down to our domestic politics as well. So it seems like from top to bottom, these policies of establishment, consistent policies of forever wars and the general stance that America's taking in the way it's confronting the possibility that it will no longer be the primary economic power in the world, is having real consequences to ordinary individuals. So I want to spend the last 5-10 minutes looking at possible solutions and directions. And you started talking about them already, the revival of the socialist movement. I mean, the undermining of Jeremy Corbyn is emblematic to me of the death of the old left in terms of its political presence as an institution of power. And now we get George Galloway, or you get others on that fringe saying we're the actual left, we're still here, the old traditional left, and the rest is dead. So there is a division amongst that fraternity as to what constitutes the left and what will be the opposition to this rising fortune for the far right. In fact, many would argue that Labour is now right of centre. It's where the old Tories used to be. And the Tories are being dragged increasingly to where BNP and where the old National Front potentially was going to be, because Nigel Farage is kind of there. Only he's wearing a suit and he makes it more edifying for people. But that's arguably what's happened on the political scale. But how do you reverse that? What is it? Awareness? Is that what's got to be the focus? Has there got to be organisation? What do you do?
Well, I mean, I think, you have to organise, agitate around the key questions, which are opposition to the wars, right? It's important to register what a debilitating effect these have, both in terms of the horrendous actions against the people of Palestine, the people of Yemen and elsewhere, which have been carried out with the assistance of the British government, right? Equally and associated with that, we have to prioritise a serious defence of multiculturalism, the need to stand up against all forms of racism, and to rebuild our society with an understanding that in a world of over 7 billion people, a nation of 65 million should have a different orientation than the nostalgia for lost empire, which dominates not just the Conservative Party and some sections of society, but also the thinking of many people inside the Labour leadership and so on, that somehow you can reclaim this. You will never be able to reclaim anything like that. You have to have a new relationship with Europe, with the global south, essentially one of respect and mutuality. And it is a protracted struggle that we are engaged in. And certainly in the global north at the moment, the situation is very serious indeed. Whereas you can see that in the global south, that progress is being made. It's difficult, but people are standing up, they are defending their countries, they are developing new economic and political relations amongst themselves, often in very contradictory positions. I mean, who would have foreseen that China would mediate between the Saudis and the Iranians? This apparently came from nowhere. It didn't. It obviously came from very serious initiatives. But in terms of traditional political thinking, this was off the board. Everything has to be done through United States. That is what the British people must register, that the role of Britain has to be different in the future, and that in order for us to address the economic problems, the social problems, and so on, we have to reprioritize the raise of the majority's living standards. At the moment, the majority of people have had their living standards depressed for decades. And now we have to ensure that there are organizations of the working class and the working people and all the poor and oppressed people in this country, which put together concentrate on raising living standards, defeating racism, and purging our society of the revolting atmosphere which has been created, particularly in these last 10 years or so.
I'm wondering about the institutions. I mean, this sounds to me like very much a grassroots, bottom-up kind of suggestion that you're giving, that people need to self-organize, develop these solutions, and change things from that lower echelon. Is that because there's no hope with the institutions, and for that to come top down? So surely government should be in this business of creating harmony and fusion in society?
I think in terms of the state institutions, we have to have a fundamental sort of approach to change them fundamentally, and that there is no exclusion here. You have an extraordinary irony when you have Robert Janik saying, the problem is we've got all these people coming over here with medieval attitudes. Now let's talk about medieval attitudes, shall we? Let's talk about the British deference to royalty, to the lords, to those with money, to those with land, which absolutely permeates our society.
Well, at least 80-90% of land in Britain still belongs to the old aristocracy, autocracy.
Absolutely. And those are the people who are saying, we are threatened by these Muslims. We are threatened by these migrants.
Well, the other argument, interesting one, I'd love to hear your response on it. They said, actually, it's our culture is being completely changed, and we're being swamped by foreign cultures. Which was fascinating. Their argument was that Serbians should remain Serbian, the English should remain English, the Chinese should remain Chinese. Almost like basically saying that we celebrate the original cultures, as if cultures don't blend and fuse and merge over history. It seems an extraordinary argument.
Yes. If they were consistent, they would say, fine, we'll give paper back to the Chinese, we'll give mathematics back to the Arabs, and so on and so on. No. A society benefits from migration. A society benefits from exchange of ideas and from learning from the peoples of the world. The idea that 65 million people, albeit a multicultural 65 million people, that 65 million people are self-sufficient and can face the world and somehow act as a leader to the world, this is preposterous stuff. But such ideas underlie the imperial nostalgia of the Conservative Party and, unfortunately, of sections of the Labour leadership, and as well, of course, of the state administration. We have to insist on a complete rewrite of Britain's relations with the rest of the world, based on mutuality, respect, common engagement, a renouncement of the forever never-ending wars and the creation of new enemies, people who have never threatened us, and we insist that they are somehow a threat. People we have a bad conscience because we were there. We occupied and invaded these countries. Iran, for example. We invaded Iran twice in the 20th century and occupied it. We were responsible for 2 major famines in Iran. We were responsible for 2 major coups in Iran, and we've held Iran under sanctions since 1979. But Iran's a threat to us. This is ridiculous.
Well, I think you mentioned BRICS, and my final, I think, focus will be on that global south issue. You talked about it not having the same existential, perhaps moral conundrums, its own navel gazing, its own failures within social constructs here up in the global north, and the result you're saying, of course, of turning to war and more chaos as a way of trying to retain that power. Is it possible for the global north to engage successfully with the global south, with these rising powers, and to recalibrate things so that everybody benefits? Or do you think ultimately imperialism is in the minds of the establishment the only way they're going to survive?
I think such engagement is both possible and necessary. There is no survival for the world unless there is a new engagement. What it is that societies like Britain, we have to come to terms with seriously our imperial and colonial past. Unfortunately, every attempt to analyse British history or to analyse British foreign policy over an extended period of time, which is critical, is regarded as unpatriotic and somehow beside the point. What we have to register is that within our midst, within Britain now, we have representatives of all corners of the world who have experience and whose knowledge will allow us to exactly make the type of re-engagement which you're talking about. If British diplomacy was lifted to the level of British society, we would have diplomats everywhere. As it is, we've got troops everywhere. And I think that's the big problem.
That sums it up. Thank you very much, Stephen Bill. That's been a fascinating journey across the world, and we've covered a lot of ground. We started the conversation really looking at the global south, the rise of the global south and the global north, and the impacts in West Asia. We ended up analysing, I guess, the psychology in the global north, and especially the actions of the leaders of the global north, which don't seem to correlate with the interests of the people. They seem, increasingly is obvious, are in the trajectory of benefiting the already very wealthy and the already very powerful. I guess our job as people is to begin to ask very awkward questions of the leaderships, which seem to be far too tied into the banking fraternity, to the corporate fraternity. That includes our media, it includes our political institutions. Questioning those institutions and perhaps even creating alternatives may well be the way forward, to create institutions which can come up with real solutions for how the global north can survive without having to pummel and imperialize its ways all over the world, something its leadership seems to be intimating is the only way they will survive. Thank you for watching this edition of The Deep Dive Perspective. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us and giving us a fascinating insight into the way the world is in the flux that we see it. And do remember to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and share widely, because it's these very conversations which will hopefully give others confidence and others the idea that actually something very wrong is happening and we need to stand up and to change it. Thank you for watching.